Hello and welcome to today's Missio Nexus webinar, 2024 Podcasting Trends and Tips. I'm Heather Pubels, the founder of Leitmotif, a communications consulting firm and Missio Nexus member organization. I'm also the editor of Evangelical Missions Quarterly. I've been partnering with Missio Nexus to offer webinars that feature ways that mission agencies can improve their marketing and communications efforts. Before we get started with the webinar today, I want to let you know that Missio Nexus has a group called Communications. If you are involved in marketing or communications with a mission agency, this group was designed for you. It's a great place for you to meet, learn from, and be encouraged by others in your domain. At the end of this webinar, I'll give you instructions on how to find and sign up for that group. A handout for today's presentation will be available near the end of our time. For today, Casey Helmick is an expert in the podcasting space who's joining us today. He works alongside top voices of culture, bringing clarity and vision to their communication. He currently produces podcasts that reach over 3 million listeners and viewers every month. He has a firm commitment to content development and content marketing and strategizing. And Casey, could you share just something about a recent project that you've been working on?
You prepped me for this and I had forgotten to think of a project. So this will really be off the cuff here, Heather. We are real excited. We just signed on with a partner some of you may be familiar with, a group called the Gospel Coalition, to do some really interesting work with them. I'm very excited for what they're doing and that we get a chance to come in and maybe make some stuff to do work in a lot of alignment with many people joining this call to further that Great Commission. So I'm really excited about that project that's coming down the pike. I can't share too much. I'll say it's a little bit of a secret project, but as you see stuff come out from them in the next 3 or 4 months, you'll know maybe I had a little part to play in it. So
That sounds great. Thanks, Casey. Just a reminder for everyone to please put your comments in the chat panel, comments and questions. We'll get to as many of them as we can. And Casey, it's great to have you here today and welcome. You can go ahead and share your screen.
perfect. And I'll underline that this area I work in, of content and podcasting, for those of you watching live, tends to produce a lot of questions, and there's nothing sort of off limits on this call. So it could be a really beginner question all the way to something a bit more ethereal. Just feel free to keep track of those, and I'm going to leave a little bit extra time than maybe normal at the end to answer that, because there's no point in learning sort of what's happening in an industry, but not knowing maybe even some of the basics of how to get started. So my talk today will cover a bit more of the theory of why I think people should be involved in podcasting. I have some practical tips along the way, but this is really to sort of set the stage and maybe hopefully create some hunger for you to look into podcasting, but also just general content that I think needs to be created. Before I get started, I always like to explain the name of our production company, which you can see our little logo here on screen. The name of our production company is called Terra Firma. And when we were thinking about a name for our company, we went back and forth and had, boring names and fancy names and things that didn't make sense and things that maybe were too practical, and sort of landed on this name because at the core and the heart of what I think our clients need, the people we get to work with and partner with need, is help creating a firm foundation to work on, and that we work in this world that seems like everything's spinning around us, and that's sort of crept into the work we do. Many of you may feel that way, that just things are moving faster than they ever have, and there's all sorts of new technologies and platforms and AI this, and we just wanted to be a partner that was known for bringing some stability and balance to the people we work with, especially the people we get to work with that are producing content around things of faith. And there's no more important discussions than what many of our partners produce around gospel centric discussions, church related discussions, general sort of Christian lifestyle, like how do you live the life of a Christian. These are very important discussions, and yet they're really hard to happen cohesively when it feels like the ground under us is constantly changing and shaking. So all of our services and partnerships and much of the advice I'm going to give you on this call sort of are centered around trying to slow the world down, trying to grab hold of an industry of content that has changed, and yet you'll see as I get in the presentation, nothing new under the sun. We're certainly doing things that have been done for since really the beginning of time. We're telling stories. We're trying to impact people and motivate them to believe in our worldview and take some action on that. So that's a little bit more about us. My presentation today is I'm a kind of a simple thinker, so I like to make presentations that are easy to follow. And so I'm going to go through 10 things I've learned from 300 million podcast downloads. Saying that number out loud feels a little silly because it's one of those really big numbers that I'm not sure the human brain was equipped and meant to work at this level scale that we tend to work at. It's hard for me to comprehend 300 million of anything. And yet I think actually I haven't updated this presentation in a few months. I think we're actually creeping up on 400 million now. And a lot of that content does directly come from people of faith, which is really exciting to see how much of that's going out to the world. So I'll run through 10 of my learnings and we'll get started here. So first of all, podcasting is a habitual platform. The average podcast listener doesn't randomly find a show. They don't accidentally stumble into our work. Very little of what we do is caused because of some sort of Google search. Podcasting is something that people look for to fill gaps in their day, such as a mom who might be homeschooling her kids and then folding laundry and then running an errand, and she has different shows that she wants to listen to at different moments of her day. Or a woman who's driving into work and she needs a 20-minute show to fill her 20-minute commute every day. I think about my family's listening habits. We often listen to things on car rides, and so we sort of save up all of our podcasts, and then when we go for a 3-4 hour car ride, we'll have a nice long list of shows that we'll listen to try to get the kids off screens and get their imaginations flowing and hopefully keep the kids from fighting in the back seat, right? So every family, every person's going to have moments in their life that they welcome podcasts into. And if your show is not consistent, if what you're making is not consistent, they can't welcome you into their life, because their life, what they need is consistency. They have these moments that happen every day or every week or every month, and if you're not there for them, it's a huge swing and a miss. There are over 45,000 podcasts added just to the Apple podcast platform in the last 90 days. So while podcasting, I said at the beginning of my talk, all things sort of made new, old things made new. Podcasting is a lot like radio. One of the key differences is that there's just a lot more being made. The entry level to wherever you work around the world, to try to get your content on a radio station, for example, it's incredibly difficult. They have a certain quality and they have a procedure. There's probably cost associated. They have very limited broadcasting space. There's very few channels that want to project what's called spoken word content, so non-music content. Of those stations, many may not want content from the genre you want to produce in. Maybe you want to try to spread the word about your organization or your mission or your purpose, and they probably don't want that. And so podcasting has allowed people of faith to project their messages at a much easier way. It's essentially, outside of making your show, it's essentially free to publish a podcast on Apple Podcasts. So 45,000 podcasts going out in the last couple months is not a surprise. Over the coronavirus season, that number skyrocketed to multiple hundreds of thousands per month. And so I think what happened in 2019, 2020, 2021, so we found a lot of people became familiar with podcasting. Everyone was stuck at home looking for entertainment. people who wanted to make things could make podcasts pretty easily. And so the podcast ecosystem has gotten quite bloated. And I share that to kind of dovetail into my second point here, you see highlighted on the screen. Only 38% of all podcasts actually remain active. We define that as a podcast that has published an episode in the last 90 days. So you see a lot of people starting, but you don't see a lot of people staying consistent and finishing well. And so before you get into something like podcasting, it's worth noting, like, are you up for the commitment? Because the end goal is not to make something that people listen to. The end goal is to make something that people listen to every week or every month or however frequent you are. And you're trying to build a community that understands the work you do, the mission you're on, the idea that you have, and that will stick with you. The power of podcasting is not short term, it's long term. It's not meant for one moment, it's meant to build a community over a long period of time. And so before you get into podcasting, or if you have a podcast already, I would, challenge you with this first thought. Can you be consistent? Can you publish something new for your people every Tuesday, like you said you were going to? And if not, it may not be the right platform for you to start on. A second point here is that practice makes better. Everybody, there's a lot of podcasts out there. Um, Podcasting is hard. Sometimes it might look easy because there are podcasters out there that have seemingly large audiences and they're just sort of chatting with friends. But hosting discussions, presenting ideas, telling a story, these are skills that need practice. We have to work hard at the skill of, for example, interviewing someone. You have to work hard at a skill of crafting a story that someone would listen to. And remember, back to my early discussion here, people are generally listening in these intimate moments, these intimate habits in their life. Again, it's the mom who's taking care of her family and she's bringing you into that world in between times. It's the manager who's driving into work, and he or she, they have 30 minutes before they get there, and it's a critical time for them to get their mind right. It's somebody who's working out at the gym. And so, if you get into this, it's important to realize you're not going to be very good at the beginning. I mean, not unless you've got some other broadcasting background. And so, while point one, be consistent. Point two is that you just have to do it. You just have to keep practicing. Here in America, everyone knows, I guess probably globally too, the name Joe Rogan. He's probably what many would be considered the most popular or most listened to podcaster right now. And his quote, what gets you good at podcasting? Time, podcast time. Just keep doing it. He's had over 2,000 interviews. It's not a surprise that people go and listen to him. And what I always like to call out for people who bring his name up, because again, he's quite famous in this industry, is that most people never heard his first 100 episodes, 500 episodes, 1,000 episodes. And in fact, he's the kind of person that now has made it pretty hard for you to go back and listen to those first ones, because those were his practice episodes, and he needed to do the art of podcasting and interviewing people to become what he has now. And he certainly got a lot of political views and things that are interesting, but most people would agree that he is a good interviewer. He does get interesting information out of people who maybe to others would look like seemingly uninteresting people. And that's taken a lot of practice. So first point, be prepared to be consistent, be committed to the art of podcasting. Second point, you just have to keep doing it to get better. It's not something that either you have it or you don't. You're not going to have it at the beginning, and you can have it with practice. Last thing I'll share on this point is that be open-minded as you're building, if you do decide to start a podcast or you have one now. And it's a scary thing to do, but as soon as you launch a podcast and you put it out in the world, the number one thing I tell new podcasters is go and ask 5 people who are close to you to give you real, authentic, sometimes raw feedback on what you could do better, and actually implement those things. Be open to the practice, be open to coaching through that season. Number three, it's something that I get asked about a lot. How do you tell if a podcast is good or not good? And most people, if you're really digging into it, will look at, well, I judge it by how many people download it. If it's good, people will listen. If it's not good, people won't. And we find this to be one helpful way to look at things, but not the only way. This is probably more applicable for anyone listening who has a podcast and is trying to figure out, is it working? I don't know. I'm not sure. And so, downloads don't mean everything. The strength of a podcast should be defined more than just the size of the audience. 37% of weekly podcast listeners say they would actually pay for exclusive original content from the shows they listen to. And so this is one way of saying, you can have a small but mighty audience. You could have, for those of you that run nonprofit organizations, you could have an audience of a couple hundred people every week that listen to your podcast. And many of those people would say, this is how I stay connected to the organization that I'm supporting. And it actually causes me to want to support financially the work that they do. Yes, it's about the work, but it's also about them keeping me informed and excited about the work through something like a podcast. And so we find that podcast listeners tend to be a very deep listener. The market for podcast listeners has grown by millions and millions and millions. In fact, I'll change to a different slideshow here before I go on and show you the numbers. But podcasting can be a very successful platform for small organizations because it is such a deep, trust built platform. When you can listen to a host, get to know them, get to know what they care about, what the organization cares about, they want to then take action. It feels different than other digital platforms we have, such as social media, which is great, and terrible at the same time, in my opinion, or an email list or a website. Podcasting provides this platform where there's an expectation of personality and trust built in a relationship. And so we do find that while downloads are one way to judge the success of a show, they shouldn't be the most important. The most important should be, will your people actually be motivated to take action with you? So I'm just going to briefly swap over to a chart here in a different slideshow. The screen should look blue now. This is the podcast. These are the number of people in this. Forgive me, this is just in the U.S., but the number of people who are aware of what a podcast is. So you can see since 2006, the growth has just been astronomical as it was measured this year. 84% of Americans over the age of 12 are now familiar with the podcast. Okay, what does that really mean? It means that they've just heard of a show, or they've heard of what a podcast is. 67% now of that same audience, Americans 12 and older, have listened to a podcast. So you can see just the growth over the course of, just under 20 years. It's gone from almost no one, 11%, all the way up to the vast majority of people. And then lastly here, how many people have listened monthly? Again, same audience, Americans 12 and older. 47% now have listened in the last month. And so it's a huge audience. When you scale this out to the US population, you're talking about 135 million. And then when you look across the globe, of course, it's much, much, much larger than that. So there's this incredible opportunity where podcasting has become a platform that is not, we don't have to do the work of teaching people what a podcast is. We don't have to do the work of teaching them how to download a podcast typically, or how to find it. We just need to be there with our stories, with our organization, with our mission, and welcome our people into it. Because the fact is, most of your people that you're trying to talk to and reach listen to podcasts. We just, looked at some of those numbers. And again, I don't have the global numbers in front of me today, but they reflect, pretty much the same there. They're already listening to podcasts. The question is, are they going to listen to yours? And so, can you be consistent? Can you practice and develop your skills long enough for people to actually enjoy listening to you? And can we look past some of the surface level cultural definitions of what a successful podcast is, and find our niche group of people who love the work we do and want to go deeper with us in that, and maybe take some action like financially supporting what we do. On that note, my tip number 4 here, a lot of people are our larger consulting company is called Content Capital. Many people come to us to figure out, I have content, but how do we raise funds through it? If I'm a nonprofit, how do I sell books? If I'm an author using a podcast, how do I build my business? If I'm, a CEO of a business and wanting to get more attention. And, our number 4 point here is that money follows attention. And I know some of these are a bit cliche statements, but we do find it to be true that here I'll read this. As monthly podcast listeners surpass over 50% of Americans, we just looked at some of those numbers. 46% of the agencies and brands that control advertising are looking into podcasting. They're spending money with podcasting. This number is, as of 2020, it's skyrocketed since then. It's well over 50%. And so you have your listeners who want to build trust with you and go deep. And if you can be consistent for them and make a podcast on a topic that they care about, they will want to financially support you. That the research and the data proves that. Also, the general market wants to support you. There are other organizations and brands that may want to place a sponsorship or an advertisement in a podcast that you're running. There's ways to work together and partner together with groups, and podcasting is becoming one of those channels that, if you have the attention that these brands or people need, that they will absolutely want to spend money with you or your organization, whatever you're representing here on this call. I'll give a quick anecdote. When I first started in this business, one of the ways I knew, oh, there's something special here in podcasting, is I met a wedding photographer and got to know the wedding photographer. They had a little podcast. I wasn't really in podcasting yet, was just sort of learning my way around things. And this person, sometimes people do this with me, they sort of overshared, and he revealed that he was making almost $10,000 a month podcasting. Gosh, that's a lot of money. How are you doing that? And turns out, in the wedding industry, one customer in the wedding industry can mean thousands and thousands of dollars for wedding venues or wedding photographers, or bakeries who are making the cake for you, or jewelers. And there's all these industries that the individual person is worth a massive amount of money. And so here this guy was running a very small wedding photography podcast. He had just 500 or 600 listeners at the time, and was making $10,000 a month. And at first I didn't believe him. I said, I got to see this. And he showed me, and we looked at things, and I just thought, this is such an interesting model that it would be worth it. And I think I always reflect that to groups that I speak to that are filled with a lot of Christian organizations and nonprofits. And most of us don't have 300 million people we're going to reach, but the power of a podcast is that trust that the host can build. And 100 podcast listeners that listen every week to your show, we have found, are worth far more than thousands of social media followers, or thousands of people on an email list, or many people visiting a website you have, or even in some cases live gatherings. You have a lot of people in a room for a webinar or an event. The power of a podcast listener, there's something special and something unique and different about it. And so we shouldn't judge a podcast by its size, by its downloads, because a small group, if you have the right attention, can be a really powerful tool for an organization to yield. So as you're thinking about, if you haven't done anything in podcasting, or you have a podcast, I hope it serves as an encouragement that if you can really harness a small group of people, a couple hundred people, a couple thousand people, into listening habitually with you, we found really great things can happen over time. Attention comes from word of mouth. So this is my 5th point here. How do you grow a podcast? How do people find out about it? And I mentioned, I don't think people accidentally find podcasts. 50% of survey respondents to this National Public Media Survey said that they found out about their podcast, which is some people also call spoken word audio, from recommendations from friends and family. And to most podcasters, this is a disappointment. They want a shortcut. They want the ability to reach a lot of people really fast. They want to be found in a Google search, or found on a search on YouTube or somewhere. And yet for organizations, especially faith-based organizations, this should be good news. We typically have great networks of people, family, friends, churches, peer organizations that others don't. Our spider webs tend to be a little more sticky if we really start to make a list of all the people we know. And they love to share a good message from us. Like they're used to sharing a sermon, a pastor's message, a book. There's already so much infrastructure built to ride on the back of family and friends sharing. And so it should, in theory, be easy for us as organizations to spread the word because we've already built those channels and mechanisms and conversations likely to do so. And so I find that, how do you build, I'm going to be consistent. I'm going to practice and get better. I'm not going to get distracted by how the culture defines what a big podcast is. I'm going to build my small niche audience. Well, how do I do that? Well, we build content and we build discussion and we ask our people, would you share this? Would you spread this? Would you get a friend listening? One of the very first hit podcasts we came out with was by a woman named Jenny Allen. She's a New York Times bestselling author now. I don't believe she was at the time, or she had just become, it was early on. She runs an organization called If Gathering. She's putting together a huge global 24-hour prayer event right now called Gather. She just does amazing work. And yet she had never podcast before. And so there was some nerves. Hey, as we launch this, how will this work? And one of the tactics we used early on to try to spread the word is we encouraged people to basically build a small group around her podcast episode. It came out every Tuesday, and we encourage people, don't listen alone, listen together. Literally grab 5 or 6 of your girlfriends or your friends from church or coworkers and make a night of it. Have dinner together, listen to the podcast, talk about it, use it as a launching off point. And that was incredibly successful for us. Initially, we didn't see the fruit of it because um, we were measuring things as downloads. And if you have one person on a speaker playing the podcast to a group of 5 people, guess what? We only get to count one download. We don't know that that room has 5 or 6 people. That's not how this technology works. But we started to realize that if you could get people in a room listening, that they would want to re-listen and share with other people outside of there. So we were starting to see the multiplication effect of that. And that infrastructure was set up before we ever showed up. The church, many people that listen to her show are from and involved in local church, and they were already used to meeting in small groups, weekly or biweekly or monthly. And so we just sort of played into an already existing habit that they had, provided a resource to it, and that's what helped her show go from where it was then to now. I think her show gets over 1 million streams a month, and it's amazing effort. And that was one of the key ways we did that. So, how do you grow your podcast? You boldly ask, not just for someone to listen, but for them to become fanatical enough that they would want to gather their friends and their family and spread it that way. Number 6, we've hinted at this already on the call, but niche content wins. I see too many podcasters trying to build the next great leadership podcast or the next great, you know, theology podcast or big category. It's like, no, what are you good at? What does your organization do that's different than anyone else? How can we really craft something around the mission of what you do? We have a client. Um, called World Concern, and they're a nonprofit that provides aid to people all around the world. By the way, there's lots of those groups, right? So we did a search. How do we find what their uniqueness was? And what we concluded is that one of their calling cards as an organization is that they would go to places, frankly, a lot of the bigger organizations wouldn't. They would go way out in the bush in Africa to serve a community of 20 people, where a larger organization needed to be able to serve thousands to accomplish their mission. And so we built a show around going to the end of the road. And I think that's actually what we ended up calling it, is the end of the road. And we went and interviewed people at the end of some of their roads and pulled stories of the uniqueness of that, because the theory for us in that organization was people give to World Concern and support the mission of what they do because they want the gospel shared all the way to the end of the road. And yet the majority of the people who give money will never be able to go there. So what if we used a podcast to bring them there? And it was hard, going out to the end of the road and recording content, in some cases digitally. Um, as you'd imagine, there's not great internet connections or phone connections, and so we battled through some of those conditions, but it was worth it because it accomplished showing off a core part of what made that organization incredibly unique. So we could have made a podcast about general, relief organization that is helping and using that mechanism to spread the gospel around the world, but instead we went a layer deeper, and the podcast has been very successful for them and their organizations. 65% of the survey respondents, again, to this National Public Media Survey, say that spoken word audio, again, another name for podcasting, provides perspectives that you don't hear or see in other media. So podcasting gives us this awesome chance to tell the story the way we want it to be told, to not have to shape and craft it and PRify it to get headlines or coverage, but to tell it in a different, unique way. And these respondents were answering the question, why do you listen to podcasts other than TV or radio coverage or social media or other platforms? And 65% said one of the key reasons we do is because it represents a perspective. It brings us a perspective that we can't get anywhere else, and they love that. And so if you know that the supporters of your organization, your work, are listening to podcasts, may not be yours because maybe you don't have one or they haven't seen it yet or heard it yet, and you know that their perspective is, we want it to be unique and different, we want it to be flavored in the way that only you can do, then that's the real journey we're on. So how do we be consistent and practice and get better at it, not get distracted by the definitions, but try to build a solid niche audience that we believe can financially support the work we do? How do we grow it through our network of family and friends and real people? That's the journey we're on to get to this place where now the obligation we have is to make something that truly is representative of who we are and not representative of other things we see out in the marketplace. I think that's a really fun and creative process that we get to go on. So I'm always excited for new podcasts to brainstorm and figure out who they could and should be. Um, Number 7 here is we're getting close to the end. Super listeners multitask. So what we define a super listener, I'll just go ahead down here. Super listener is somebody that's listening every single week to our shows. That's sort of our holy grail. That's what we chase after. And so a super listener, or every week they never miss listener, they are busybodies. We know that through the research that's been done. Again, 79% of respondents say they're listening to more podcasts because it allows them to do stuff. They're writing. They might even be, I know this sounds crazy to some, they might be reading a book. They might be watching TV. The podcast might be a little passive for them, but they enjoy podcasting because they can multitask and function while it's happening. And again, to my earlier points, I love working in an industry where I am in the earbuds of people in their most intimate moments. It's the college student studying for an exam. It's the mom taking her kids to school. It's all these really intimate life moments. And the listener loves podcasting because it opens up the ability for them to both work and be functional in society and grow and learn and develop and hear different perspectives. And what better place to be than in your supporters, your organization supporters' ears, literally in their ear, while they're living their life. I think it's such an awesome opportunity, and it makes podcasting so different than social media, where you're flipping through a feed or an email that you're trying to. Frankly, a lot of us probably have this. You're trying to just clear your inbox to try to dig out, or watching a television show to sort of turn the brain off for the night, whatever your media outlet might be. There's places and times for all of those, but the place and time for podcasting is directly embedded in your supporters, or your future supporters' life. And I think that's such a cool opportunity. Number 8, all podcasts need a story arc. Let me even say this a different way. We just need to make more creative things. I think the typical entry point I see for organizations coming in and wanting to do a podcast is an interview podcast, or some form of what we're doing today, kind of like a webinar where there's content being shared. There's a place for those. I don't want to, knock those, but I think where there's a lot of opportunity are for those of you that have stories to tell, for those of you that have an arc that you can take your listener on or your supporters on, that you can bring them from a moment where they didn't understand something to a moment when they now feel equipped and almost as an expert in something. And I think sitting down before you start a channel like a podcast and think, if we had just 10 episodes to communicate with someone, what would the 10 episodes be? Treat it more like writing a book than creating a radio show. And I think there's some real deficit in the marketplace for shows that are well thought out in this way. 58% of survey respondents say that spoken word audio, again, podcasting, feels newer and fresher than what you hear on live radio. They're looking for something that is well thought out and storyified for them. They want to go on a journey, give them a reason to not only listen today, but be excited to come back next Thursday to listen to the next episode. Now, it doesn't mean that everyone's going to be turned into some sort of serialized entertainer, but it does mean that we should be thought out enough that we know where we're going and where we're leading people, and that we're not just interviewing the next person that we can convince to show up. And so, be thought out, be planned, my background I think is blurred today, but I have a whiteboard back here. Like, get a whiteboard out and start sketching out what's the story arc that I'm taking people to. And again, I'll use the world concern example. We want to introduce people to the idea that there are real life stories at the end of this road that we go to, and many roads. And we knew in the first season that we developed that we wanted to take people to multiple locations of the end of the road, multiple continents. And at the end of the series, we wanted to reveal to them what we had done, that we had shown them that while there are incredibly unique features at the end of each of these roads, what we actually found is that there's a lot of similarities, that people need the gospel, first of all, that, parents want a future for their kids, that kids want the ability to dream in safety and learn. We found all these similarities at the end of the road. And there was a beautiful moment in that story where we had been able to tell the uniqueness of each end of the road and why your support matters, but also the similarities of just humans, and that we have this connectedness. And so it's one thing to, in that scenario, to bring people to each individual end of the road and show them how their money has been spent. It's a completely different exercise to show them that the people at the end of the road want the same thing that we do. They have the same build of God that we do. And there's a beauty in that, and a connectedness in that was hard to do on any other platform. It's hard to show that on a photo on social media, or send an email explaining that. And so, be thought out that way. It didn't really take any extra work to develop that storyline. We just came up with that story at the beginning and tried to execute it along the way. So, number 9 here, podcasts and books are cousins. Many of you probably, most of you, I hope, are readers. Many of you may be authors, or in work with authors. And so, here 54% of the US population now has listened to an audiobook. That number is actually higher. Again, this is from a 2020 study. And we know from the multiple research studies that have been done with podcasters, or podcast listeners tend to be more educated. They tend to be explorers. They tend to be readers. They are coming to the podcast platform to expand their minds and their worldview, and end their day feeling accomplished in what they've consumed. And it's a lot of similar purposes with books. And so for those of you that have written a book or are big readers, bringing that experience into podcasting produces incredible results. Again, even to how you write the story of what you're trying to do in your podcast, thinking of it as the table of contents of your book, is a helpful strategy there. So just, reflecting back that, again, to be consistent, to be practiced, to cut through the cultural definitions of what a good podcast is, to build that niche audience, to help your people grow it, And then, of course, to recognize that the audience that's waiting for you there, these are likely people you already know that are listening to other shows, and they're hunting for the same types of content that they find in books, things that can motivate and educate them. Some of the most popular categories in podcasting tend to be history, and tend to be things related to government and politics. Religion is the second largest category in podcasting. And so people are looking to learn and be motivated to take action. Last thing here, I've hinted at this one, sort of become a cliche in my industry. Frankly, everyone says this, but audio is just this incredibly intimate platform. There's actually some scientific studies going on right now about the power of being in someone's actual, I have a set of them here, like their actual earpods. There's a power in that. In the very early days of mankind, we would sit around proverbial fire, maybe a real fire, and tell stories to each other, and you'd sit and you close your eyes and you'd listen to these things happening, and your imagination would bring to life what you were hearing. There's power in that. There's always been power in that. I think even in the scripture, you hear like moments where God audibly speaks to people and it totally changes their life. Of course, that's because of how magnificent and holy God is, but also like he could have communicated in lots of different ways. Sometimes he did, through written format or thing, but it's always been interesting to me that God himself like and it speaks into us audibly in this way, and we get a chance to like reflect that through podcasting. And podcasting has brought in things like videos and other capabilities, but at its core, a podcast is a way to, while someone is living their life, be with them and communicate with them and build trust with them. 60% of survey respondents say they're listening to more podcasts because they have found a host who they can identify with. They become your friend. You become a trusted advisor to them. You become that person that, gosh, I like when they go to pick their kids up from school, they're thinking about that, but they're also excited because they know it's their time they get to spend with you for 20 minutes while they wait, and they get to do life with you. And this is the end outcome we want. This is every organization I work with. This is what they want. They want a deep relationship with of course, their supporters, their volunteers, the families, and the people who work for their organization. They want a deep relationship being built, and they want those people to then take that relationship and share it with others. And I'll relate this back to the Great Commission, thinking about what all of you are focused on, that this is how God built it, right? That we would hear and that we would then go and share it. And so I love working on a platform that functions that same way. And I've always thought, as I've read through the Gospels and Acts and watched the gospel sort of begin to spread, I've always thought how hard it must have been in the very, very early days to walk in as a stranger to a new culture, and share a message that's so radical, or would have been interpreted that way at the time, and is so different and unique and fresh and new. And how do you build trust in that environment? They must have worked so hard to do what we're describing here, to become someone who their listeners, their audience could identify with and could feel and and say, yes, what they're talking about, the questions they're asking, those are things I've wondered, those are things I've felt and I processed. And that's what we all exist to do. It's what, hopefully all of you watching live and maybe in recording, that's what you exist to do, is to take this great thing and to build trust with people so that they can hear it and they can believe it and they can take action on it. And so, I've always been drawn to podcasting because so many people are naturally coming up to this stage and asking for it. Last story I'll tell here, and then I'll bring Heather back in because we'll have some time for Q&A. But one of the really massive confirmations that I was in working in the right industry happened to me during the global pandemic that we all just lived through over the last few years. And at the beginning of it, I don't know if you all remember the timing, but there was a season when the virus was hitting Italy very hard. Italy was one of those early countries that had just really been decimated by it. And they had a major lockdown in Italy, like don't leave your house lockdown. And some data came out a couple months later that the number one searched podcast genre that had the most growth, the most new listens from the country of Italy during that time frame was religion. I thought, gosh, were we prepared? Did we have the right content and shows and availability up so that when people were at this incredibly scary moment in their life and they had nowhere, literally nowhere to go, and they were looking on the internet for things that could provide them hope and support and help, and they came to podcasting for probably the first time ever based on the data. And there's 400% growth in religion shows and listenership in Italy that over that season. um, had we done the work to prepare for that season that God provided? And the answer was probably no. I hope there were many people steered towards things that could help them. I'm confident that God could do that. But it was such a good challenge to me of how do we get more meaningful content in this channel of podcasting so that whatever God's up to next, whatever he's headed, tomorrow, when that search happens, when that person is in their home in Italy, not knowing where else to run, and they come to the channel that God's given me to work in, that there would be the perfect message for them to provide them hope and purpose. And I've left that just feeling like there's a lot of work still for us to do. So much of my talk today, as I'm wrapping, is focused on the opportunity ahead, and I'll just wrap with giving you a challenge that I think we as organizations and people trying to further the Great Commission, we have an obligation to use the tools of our time to go to the end of the earth. And so I challenge you to really consider podcasting and how this could be a tool that not only is there an opportunity for you to be in, but is God calling us to fill this channel with gospel, messaging that that person's going to need whenever the moment comes. So that's my talk, Heather. I'd love to do lots of time here for questions and ask you to come on back in, and we'll get started.
Thanks, Casey. This is great. Thank you also for that encouragement. I think I certainly agree with that. I know many here on the call do. We do want to use the tools that God has provided. So I've got a bunch of questions for you. I'll get started with a question from Randy. Are there any books that you would recommend or other resources that give very practical guidance on setting up a podcast?
Ooh, any books? That's an interesting one. I've done a lot of these talks. I don't know that anyone's ever asked me about a book. I will include not a book. I'm not aware of any great books. Maybe that's a challenge for us to write a book, but I have a few really good blogs of companies that do real practical tips of how to get started. And I'll follow up with Heather and make sure those get sent out as a resource. These companies are the ones that you would actually go to host your podcast. And so they have, a shared interest in getting you started, and they provide really practical tips on how to get your podcast set up, how to name a podcast, how to design the artwork for it. So I'll make sure we send through a blog resource, but unfortunately I'm not aware of any written books, and you got my wheels turning over here.
All right, next question. Podcasts vary in length, and when you're starting, what's a good length to aim for?
That's a great question. It's probably the number one question I get asked. Let me give a little nuance here. Your podcast should be exactly as long as you need to tell your story, but that's the cop-out answer. There's podcasts that range from 3 minutes to 3 hours, even longer. And I typically tell people to figure out what can you do in 20 to 30 minutes. To my presentations point, podcasts are generally listened to in habits, and a lot of things we do now in culture happen in little 20-minute, 30-minute segments. You might be driving for 30 minutes or walking the dog around the neighborhood or whatever you might be doing. And so I generally encourage people to start with 20 or 30 minutes and prove why it needs to be longer or why it needs to be shorter.
Sounds good. Okay. How do you feel about doing video versions of podcasts? Is it necessary? And are younger or international audiences expecting your podcast to be on YouTube?
Yeah. Oh man. Somebody smart asked this question. They're paying attention. The last 2 years, my industry's changed completely. It has become a bit of an expectation to have something available on video, and YouTube just presents this incredible opportunity to reach more people. And it used to be young people, but frankly, I think there's a lot more people using YouTube that are 40, 50, 60 even. We have a show that we run that has an average list of viewership on YouTube of 78 years old. And so I think the opportunity, what I would change in that question is YouTube and video is not a reach the next generation tool anymore. It's just reach more people, reach a more people tool. And I do think it helps with global reach. I think YouTube has become a great global platform that sort of spans into most countries. There are some countries, just to be aware, some of you may do work in trying to reach hard to reach people groups. Usually what we find is those countries, many of them are a bit more strict on how they allow their citizens to engage with platforms like YouTube or social media platforms. And so generally I say video is a good idea, but it should not be the reason that you do not do a podcast. For many, it becomes an excuse. I can't do it because I would have to do video and I don't have a camera, or I don't look good on a camera, or I don't let it be an excuse to stop. If that is your excuse, persevere and make an audio only show. If you are open to the idea of having some sort of video content, I'd encourage you to start, even if it's recording things and putting out little small clips from your show. Maybe you're not comfortable yet putting out the whole episode, but video is a very important part of our industry now.
A comment and question from Daryl. I like the small group idea to share podcasts. We want to share stories of mission work and demystify it as something anyone can do right where they are now. Also, I missed how the wedding photographer monotonized his listeners to get 10,000 a month.
Yeah. So yeah, I'll clean that section up there. So um, the wedding photographer had many brands that have decided I can pay a lot of money to reach your niche audience because one of your customers is worth a lot of money to me. So he only has to work with maybe a wedding venue or a baker that makes cakes, because I don't know if any of you have had a wedding anytime recently in your family, but a wedding cake costs a lot of money these days, or a venue might cost a lot of money. So my point in that section is that the value in podcasting isn't in reaching the millions, it's reaching the perfect group that you have a plan for. So for many of us that run organizations, what is a donor, sorry to talk this way, I don't like to talk about money too often, but what's a donor worth to you? What's the value of a donor? And how many of those would it take to be listening to you every week and contributing to the work you do to make a podcast worth your time? And it might only be 100 or 200. And so we look at podcasting not as the chance for us to reach millions, but the chance for us to reach the perfect group that brings value. And in the wedding photographer case, he only had to reach 400 or 500 people for brands to find his channel very valuable.
That's great. Another question from Randy. How do you build your email list through podcasting?
That's a great topic. I think the most successful techniques I've seen are, and it sort of ties into the small group idea. When you're going through a series with people as a podcast, maybe we're going to do a series around mental health and the topic of mental health for our people. Having a downloadable resource available on your website that you can call out in your podcast, say, hey, if you're following this series and you've enjoyed what we're doing, we have this extra resource that you can find on our website. Here's the link to it. That's usually the best way to sort of get people from podcasting to take an action like signing up for an email. Again, as you're building that story arc, I'd encourage you to think about, like, where's the landing strip for them? What's the action we want them to take? And it doesn't always have to be give us money or support. It could be that there's an additional resource or a book that you want them to have, an ebook, an audiobook, but getting them to your website and getting them to sign up for an email is going to be your best bet.
Okay, another question here from Brian to Randy's question about resources. I host a YouTube channel designed specifically to help new podcasters get started. If it's worth passing along the appropriate channel is Summit City Studios, if not appropriate. Yeah, that's great. Brian, so Summit City Studios might be something that our listeners would want to check out. Thank you for sharing that comment. Avery has a question. How do you suggest handling a situation where a guest joins your show and says something your organization disagrees with?
Hmm.
Suggest more intense screening on the front end, or do you have tips regarding facilitating this situation after the fact?
Yeah, well, most of the shows that we do are not like this setting where we're live. So typically you're going to record a podcast and it's just going to be to tape, and you can clearly edit and take things out if there's things you don't agree with. I don't like to be, to your question, I can't remember how you phrase it. I don't like to be too guarded on the front end. I certainly like to give a rubric to guests of here's where we're headed, here's a list of questions or topics, but I don't want them to feel like they need to hold back during the interview because it's typically not live. And I try my best when I work with our partners to get them to communicate to guests beforehand. This is not a live interview. We will be editing things that maybe I say that I misspeak on, things that maybe you say. And I try to set the stage that what you say in this recording will not be the final product. We're going to craft it and make it into something that we will find valuable. And so, for the most part, as long as you communicate up front with people that it's not live and that you're going to kind of manipulate, that might be a bad word, but sort of manipulate the conversation to craft it into something that is useful, you generally won't have very many issues. I would just encourage you, try not to dampen their excitement before they show up for the interview by giving them 1,000 guardrails. Let them be who they are. If you find that it's a persisting issue, it probably is related to the guest that you're inviting on. You probably should look at who am I inviting and why do I keep getting things that I don't align with. Um, it is also another reason, back to my practice helps you. Um, you have to be prepared in your early days of podcasting that likely there will be some things that you have to edit and cut out because you may ask a question in a way that doesn't elicit the answer you want, or you might not be able to guide the conversation back to a safe zone as quickly as you may want to. And so I would just encourage you to have a good editor that can make you sound the way you should sound. And then, of course, lastly, Heather, on the question, you never have to put anything out you don't want to because it's all to tape. If an interview doesn't go well, I think being honest with the person that, hey, we'd like to have you back on, but we just didn't feel like we nailed it and we want to put you in your best light. And so we're going to have you back on and we want to focus on these 4 things and maybe avoid talking about this thing. I think it's worth getting right and maybe doing it over if we have to.
Sounds great. Another question here from Charles. What are some basic tools, equipment, and I'll add software
Yeah.
that you would recommend?
Yeah, some of the resources a couple of the blogs I'll send through to you, Heather, that people can click through will have literal blogs that are like the top 10 microphones, the top 10 webcams, the top 10. So I won't get into too many specifics there because some of the resources I'll send through will help with that. But I'll give you price points to get started. In general, you should be able to get somewhere between a $30 and $100 microphone. This microphone that I'm using here is semi fancy. It's a little blurred out, but this one cost $150. My webcam cost, I think it was $99. But total in to do a podcast right, you can get started for around $100, of equipment. It used to be that this stuff cost us thousands of dollars, and now it's so much cheaper. I would encourage you to do it right if you're going to do it. Get like the webcam I'm using again. I think it was $100. It's enough for me. It gets the job done for me. Could I have a $5,000 camera pointed at me? Certainly. Would that have stopped me from doing what we're doing today? I hope not. I'm here. And so I would say somewhere between $100 or $200 and $300 or $400 is where you should be starting. And so as you look through these blogs, if they have something that costs $1,000, don't start there unless you have a circumstance for it. Start on the small end and upgrade as you go. The one tool I like to call out for people, and again, I can include this in links I'll send you, Heather, but there's a tool called Riverside, and it's sort of an upgraded version of Zoom. For those of you that have done an interview, written books, and done interviews or whatever you may have done, you've probably used this tool. It's become quite popular. and it has become sort of the go-to podcast recording tool on your computer. And it has a lot of features, like it'll make social media clips for you. It'll capture the audio and video much cleaner than maybe a Zoom does. That I think that tool costs $15 a month. Don't quote me on that, something around that. And it's such a good upgrade for podcasters. And their goal as a company is to build sort of a podcast in a box tool. You flip record button on and it sort of does a lot of the work for you. And so that would be the number one tool I'm not affiliated with them or anything, but we do use it on almost all of our podcast recordings these days. So that's one you should look up today if you're doing a podcast or want to do one.
Sounds good. Is there anything else that you would like to share, Casey, before we begin wrapping up here?
Um, I have just sort of a lingering thought, so I'll say it out loud because I don't know. If it's stuck back there, it's probably meant to come out. But when I started in podcasting, the religious category of shows were almost exclusively mega church pastor. I mean, nothing wrong with mega church pastor, I guess, at face value. Maybe there's some things that they need to clean up generally in culture these days, but there wasn't a problem with that outside of that anecdote I told you of that person stuck in their house in the middle of a scary time, and they went, and all it looked like we had available were the biggest churches in America and sermons. And if that, for whatever reason, wasn't a good entry point for someone, then they probably moved on and went and listened to a comedian show or a true crime show or something. And over the last 5 or 6 years, if you look at the religious category of podcasting, it's gotten a lot more diverse. There's a lot more women hosted shows, which is awesome to have that point of view. There's parenting shows. There's Christian comedian shows. There's all this wide, diverse reach now and content type. I'm really proud of that. And so if you haven't looked at religious podcasting recently, I'd encourage you to just become a consumer before you start making, and look around to see what's there, and maybe look around to see what's not there and what you believe should be there related to what the work you do, and build that. And we need more diversity, and it's come a long way, but there's so much further we can go. And so there's probably a place at that table for you. That's been really kind of this section of my life. That's been the work I've truly been doing, is trying to get us from the biggest churches in the world to the long list of things that Christians creatively can produce, and making sure that's available for that moment. So if you haven't consumed in a while, come back, give some shows a listen, see what else is out there. There's some good, there's some bad. A friend just sent me a link to a show that was hopefully this person's not on this call, but it was Harry Potter and the spiritual ways of the world. And I'm like, oh, I don't think this is probably the right direction to steer. But it's entertaining, I guess. So there's lots of diversity in the religious category, and there's probably space for you, but come back and consume. That may be the right step for some of you on this call.
I have one more question here from
Okay.
Brian. What have you picked up as a podcast host just by listening to a variety of other hosts and their styles?
So I'll be clear. I should have made this clear at the beginning. I am not a host. I just help. I am the ghost in the background that makes we run about 80 shows that make them work. But I'll try to answer that question because I talk to a lot of hosts. I think if you are interviewing people, the number one tip I give is to try to find a question that they've never been asked before, and to get that in and sort of surprise your guest with it, and try to get an authentic response from your guests. The other thing that I see a lot of hosts struggle with is that, it's easy to feel inadequate and alone in this industry. You're speaking into a microphone. Even on this call, Heather, you and I can look at each other, but there's dozens of people on this call. I don't know what any of them look like. I don't know what any of them sound like. I don't know where they are in the world. And that's what it feels like to be a podcaster. So I guess I can relate here, even on this call. That's a lonely work. And so I find that podcast hosts that perform at their best get to know other podcasters and lament in the hard times and share excitement in the good times, and are a part of a podcast community of hosts, not just off on their own. The podcasters that I find that are burnt out, one of the first questions I ask them is, who else do you talk to? Who are your peers? And very often, sadly, they say, I don't know any other podcasters. I don't know, and I don't know who my audience is, and I just sort of sit in my office and talk, and I hope people are listening. And that's a really sad way to live life. And so, get to know other podcasters and and really practice that craft and be a part of the community. And I think good things can happen.
That's awesome. Thank you very much, Casey.